He opened with a focus on the question of nuclear deterrence management and the broader challenges the United States must face in ensuring credible capabilities. He said that when decisions are made about withdrawing or changing posture, there remains a real question on conducting an explosive test. And he added, that's a harder call. In his view, the harder call stems from the need to preserve the underlying credibility of deterrence, a credibility rooted not only in capability, but in the willingness to demonstrate and sustain that capability. He explained, we need to make sure our systems are capable of demonstrating, and that way we make sure they're speaking again. His language is striking in its metaphorical use of speaking again, indicating that deterrence rests on clear signaling, not just latent capacity. He thereby argues that maintaining the systems themselves is only part of the equation. Ensuring that adversaries believe those systems will be used if necessary is equally vital. When asked about submarine tracking, surprise attacks, and the shifting domain of space warfare, he broadened the question to include multiple domains of strategic competition. He said the US must ensure it is never put in a position where adversary submarines operate undetected and surprise the US. He stressed that capabilities in space, especially fast-moving weapon systems, are rapidly evolving. He thus asserted, we need to make sure we're never in a position to identify and track our adversary submarines to surprise us. And there's a lot in space, and capable and fast-moving weapon systems in space to deploy, make sure deterrent is available, and ability to counter those with offensive capabilities remains world-class at first, and we're today, but can never let up. This extended quote underscores several things. One, that deterrence is not simply about defense, it is about ensuring an ability to counter an offense if required. Two, that the strategic environment now stretches beyond traditional domains to undersea and outer space. Three, that readiness is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing posture. We're today, but can never let up. The ellipsis reflects how he paused, but the meaning is clear: sustained vigilance. In short, his framing elevates the concept of deterrence from static to continuous, and from defensive to multi-domain. Turning to Latin America, and specifically the case of Venezuela, he framed the issue in stark security and criminal terms. A country, he argued, presents a threat to the American homeland through illicit flows and regime behavior. On Venezuela, he said, we need to deter what they're doing down there and undermine our country, and they're bringing drugs to kill Americans and prosecute them and put pressure on the Venezuela regime. And one day, the people and country of Venezuela is a simple and normal nation living peacefully in the Caribbean along our southern edge. The statement moves quickly from immediate threat, drug trafficking, pressure on the US, to a vision of a transformed Venezuela, a simple and normal nation living peacefully in the Caribbean along our southern edge. The choice of wording frames the US southern border not simply as a geographic line, but as a strategic edge implicitly vulnerable if proximity is not managed. He then addressed the question of how any new peace plan or intervention might differ from previous efforts. He made clear that in his view, the plan must be distinctly American in character and devoid of ties to certain international actors he judged as ineffective. He said, we need to develop a security operation that's going to be made American and going to not connect to Hamas and not connected to the United Nations, and neither of those have been able to deliver, and President Trump can put that in place and can keep the peace and stability, then that's not in America's interest. Here he explicitly invokes Donald Trump as the one who can put that in place and can keep the peace and stability. The reference to Hamas and the UN is rhetorical. In his view, these are frameworks that have failed, and the security operation must hence be anchored in direct American leadership rather than multilateral intermediaries. Putting all the pieces together, he offered a three-pronged strategic architecture. First, maintain credible and demonstrable deterrence across nuclear, maritime, and space domains. Second, treat proximate states, such as Venezuela, as genuine security challenges linked to US national interest. Third, design peace and security operations that are distinctly American, avoiding what he perceives as weak or compromised multilateral institutions. He stressed that credible deterrence begins with clear capability. Without the capacity to act, and to act visibly, deterrence loses its bite. He argued that adversaries need to believe not only they might be hit, but we will. And from that, he moved into the maritime space sphere. Submarine tracking is a baseline, but increasingly fast-moving weapons in orbit and other domains demand not only monitoring, but offensive readiness. The vocabulary of surprise us and deploy underscores his posture. Vigilance must be matched by flexibility and offence. He added that today the US may have that capability, but can never let up. It is a continuous dynamic posture. On the subject of Venezuela, his framing is sharp. He describes Venezuela's actions as a threat to American citizens through narcotics and pressure. His statement draws a direct line. What happens in Venezuela matters to the US homeland. He does not couch the issue solely in terms of governance or humanitarian crisis, but in strategic and security terms. The vision he offers, a peaceful Caribbean nation along the US southern edge, is normative and transformational. However, it is also prescriptive. He implicitly advocates for American-led engagement to bring that vision about. His proposed peace plan is intentionally distinctive, made American, independent of the UN, separate from Hamas affiliations. He suggests that prior efforts by multilateral institutions or other actors have failed. He further elevates Donald Trump as the actor who can put that in place and can keep the peace and stability. The implication is that the US must take direct ownership of the operation rather than delegate or rely on others. The conversation ends with the acknowledgement of the wide sweep of his career, a thank you for service, for roles across congressional, intelligence and diplomatic arenas. His background was noted as unique, from congressional representative to CIA director to Secretary of State. In assessing the commentary, several themes emerge. His view of deterrence is expansive. It must be credible, demonstrable, and multi-domain. It must cover nuclear tests or the threat thereof, undersea submarine threats, and space-based weapons systems. The key line: we need to make sure our systems are capable of demonstrating. That way we make sure they're speaking again, encapsulates this. He suggests deterrence without demonstration is hollow. While his first focus is on global strategic domains, he moves quickly to approximate regional threats, especially Venezuela. His framing is notable because it reframes Venezuela not just as a crisis for the country itself, but as a strategic threat to the US. His description of drugs to kill Americans and of pressure on the Venezuela regime positions US-Venezuela relations in national security rather than purely diplomatic or humanitarian terms. He rejects reliance on existing multilateral structures, the UN, or organizations he considers compromised, Hamas affiliation, and instead calls for a US-led operation made American. He ties this operation to the leadership of Donald Trump, thereby signaling a partisan dimension, even as he frames it in terms of national interest. The phrase, "neither of those have been able to deliver," referring to Hamas United Nations, is a critique of existing architecture and a call for a redesigned model. Repeatedly, he emphasizes that readiness can never be relaxed. We can never let up. Whether speaking of submarine detection or weapons in space or nuclear tests, the message is the strategic environment is changing rapidly, and any lapse in capability or will invite risk. This is not a one-time posture, but a sustained requirement. Across the board, his argument places the United States at the core, the guarantor of peace, the central actor in deterrence, the leader of regional operations. Whether in global domains or Latin America, his prescriptions assume active US leadership rather than delegation. In sum, the conversation places the United States in a posture of high responsibility, broad operational scope, and constant vigilance. It frames key strategic arenas: nuclear deterrence, undersea and space warfare, regional proximate states, as interconnected and requiring an integrated American approach. From a journalistic vantage point, the remarks raise several questions for further examination. What is the current status of US capability in each of the domains he mentions: nuclear test readiness, submarine tracking, space weapons? How credible are those capabilities to adversaries? How does his framing of Venezuela align with current US policy under the sitting administration? Is the vision of a simple and normal nation living peacefully in the Caribbean along our southern edge a workable objective, and what means would be pursued? His critique of the UN and Hamas involvement in peace operations suggests rejection of multilateral solutions. What are the implications for US diplomacy and international legitimacy? The emphasis on made American operations and reference to Trump implies a partisan or ideological dimension to US strategy. How might that affect bipartisan support or continuity? The constant vigilance posture he proposes may require sustained funding, new systems, and institutional changes. What are the trade-offs and opportunity costs? His remarks do not shy away from forceful language: drugs to kill Americans, fast-moving weapons in space, surprise submarine attacks. The rhetoric is meant to sharpen the sense of urgency, yet it should also be understood as commentary from a former senior official rather than an administration policy statement. It reflects one strategic worldview rather than necessarily the entirety of current US strategy. His approach is forward-leaning, stressing offence and demonstration rather than purely restraint and diplomacy. That posture may resonate in certain strategic communities, but it also raises the question of risk escalation, signalling thresholds, and the diplomacy-military balance. For viewers or listeners, the takeaway is this: Mike Pompeo sees the US facing a more challenging strategic environment than ever, one in which adversaries operate across domains in undersea, space, and regional theatres, one in which proximate states like Venezuela are cast as potential threats to the homeland, and one in which existing multilateral architectures are judged insufficient. The remedy he proposes is a strongly American-led, capability-rich, continuously vigilant posture, anchored in the ability not just to deter, but to demonstrate the capacity to act.